is Spicing Up the Syllabus Workshop Part 2. And this part here is how to write program objectives and outcomes. So it'll be interactive, so I'll let you all jump in when you're ready to jump in and talk about your programs. So goals and objectives, they're similar. That they describe the intended purpose and the expected results of teaching activities, and they establish the foundations of the assessment. That's where our goals and our objectives come in now. The goals are statements about the general aim or the purpose that we want to take that course to. They're broad, they're long range, they're intended outcomes and concepts. They give the clear communication of the course, or you can do it for a program as well. And they're problem solving. Now, objectives, that's when the umbrella breaks down a little bit narrower. They're brief, they're clear statements, and they describe the desired learning outcome of the instruction and the specific skills, the values, and the attitudes the student should exhibit that reflect the broader goals. Our learning objectives. Here. And if you notice, you all have handouts. There are 3 types of learning objectives. Now, there's the cognitive objective. That one is what you want your candidates to know. There's the affective objectives, and that's what you want them to think about. So it's what I want them to know, what I want them to think about, and then the behavioral objectives. Those are what I want the students to be able to do. So cognitive is our mind, it's what I want you to know. The affective is what I want you to think about, and the behavioral, again, is what I want you to be able to do. Objectives can also reflect different levels of learning. So I can take you to mastery or the developmental. And when I'm referring to mastery, that's concerned with the minimum performance of performance essentials. Those learning tasks and skills that must be mastered before moving on to the next. And when I think about mastery, I'm thinking of math. I start off with the basics. I move you to the next level. I get you to the next level. So I start with basic addition. 1 single-digit addition before I can move you to 2-digit addition, and then get you to regrouping. There's also the developmental objectives. Those are a little more complex learning outcomes. Students can be expected to demonstrate varying degrees of progress at that one. So developmental, it's different levels. And then there's also instructional objectives. These describe in detail the behaviors that students will be able to perform at the conclusion of a unit or instruction, such as a class. It's more like a formative and summative assessment. What do I want the students to be able to demonstrate at the end of the class? Any questions? So, what's the difference? There are goals and there are objectives. Both goals and objectives use the language of the outcome. Outcome is what I want the students to be able to do. The characteristics which distinguish goals from objectives is the level of, what's that word? That's okay. So goals express the intended outcomes in general terms. And then objectives, if I move over to this side, they express them in specific terms. So I've got general terms, which is sort of broad and narrow, and then objectives are going to be specific terms. Learning outcomes.
So an example of the goals and objective, can you go back a second?
Mm-hmm.
Say I have a typing class, and my goal is to teach students to type. My objective would be students will type 65 words.
Yes, because it's more specific. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's good. I like that. Great example. So, learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are significant are statements that describe significant essential learning that the learners have achieved and can reliably demonstrate at the end of the course program. So that's our outcomes. The outcomes, they identify what the learner will know, will be able to do by the end of the course. The essential, go ahead.
So an example, let's take the same typing class.
Mm-hmm.
So in the typing class, my outcome would be to familiarize students with the computer, if that's in fact what we're using,
Mm-hmm.
that will allow them to type 65 words a minute?
Yes.
Would that be my outcome?
That would be your outcome, because that's what you want them to be able to do. What is it that I want them to do? The learning outcomes approach to education means basing the program and the curriculum design, content delivery, and assessment on an analysis of the integrated knowledge, skills, and values needed by both the student and society. So how am I going to intertwine the student to the society for that skill? In this outcome-based approach to education, the ability to demonstrate learning is the key point. So the learning outcome, for them to be able to demonstrate it, is our key point. Now we look at objectives versus outcomes. As we go back, what's an outcome? What's an objective? I'll say that.
The objective is specific.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say goal, but I know that's not right. But a specific thing I want them to do, whereas the outcome is also a doer.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you should be able to do when you leave that class.
Yes, it should be what you're able to do and apply it to society.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So objectives, when we compare the two, it's intended results or consequences of the instruction, the programs, or activities. Again, it's specific. Specific types of performance and activities the students are expected to demonstrate at the end. That's our objective, which sounds almost like the outcome. Often written in terms of teaching intentions and typically indicate the subject content and that the instructor intends to cover. This is what I intend to cover. That's my objectives. So if you think of objectives, it's what I'm expecting or my intended course, like you said, the SWOT analysis. You know that SWOT analysis is very important to a project manager. So my objective is to teach the students about the SWOT analysis. That's my objective. However, we may not get to that, but that's our objectives. Now, the outcome, achieved results, consequences. Now these, again, I'll say achieved results or consequences of what was learned. It is the evidence of what you're learning. So when I think about outcomes, I go back to almost to assessments. Even though I'm not covering the assessments, it makes me think of what would my assessment, what am I going to assess? What should be the outcome? And if you use a backward design in your program, you'll think about your assessment, your outcome, before you do your objectives. That's if you use the backward design. But if you don't use the backward design, you'll start off with what's my objective, and then you'll move on to your outcome.
So what's the benefit in doing the assessment
First.
first?
Because then you're thinking about what is it that the student should master.
My end result.
Yes, in the beginning. So that's where that backward design comes from. It's student-centered. Outcomes are student-centered, so it's not, I want to teach, or I will teach, or the students will learn. It's what the students are actually learning in your class. And sometimes we'll learn in our courses that we'll start off with our objectives, but then there's some prereqs that the students need prior to. So we may go back and teach those because I can't get you to mastery if I haven't taught you the prereqs first. Statements that specify what learners will know or be able to do as a result of the learning activity. It's precise, again, specific. It's measurable. They can be more than one outcome, so you can have more than one outcome for your course, such as you may have more than one goal. Any questions? So questions that learning outcomes address. And some of the questions are, what knowledge, skills, abilities, and dispositions should the ideal student graduating from your program demonstrate? So if I've had a student who's taken my typing course, by the time that candidate graduates, what should they be able to do? Should they be able to type 60 words a minute? Should they be able to sit in the typing position, which is how my typing instructor in junior high taught us. You have to put your both feet on the floor, wrists up. So what should they demonstrate? How will they be able to demonstrate these capabilities? And how well does our program prepare the students for careers? And this is for graduation, sorry, misspelling, professional study, and or lifelong learning. So those are some questions that you should ask yourself when you're putting together your learning outcomes. So the structure of learning outcome statement. For one, an action word, you're going to use an action word that identifies the performance to be demonstrated. And there are some action verbs on one of the handouts. Define, apply, analyze. These are some action verbs that you can use. Articulate, apply, arrange, appreciate. A learning statement that specifies what learning will be demonstrated in the performance. So you're using your action verb, what's going to be demonstrated, and then a broad statement of the criterion of the standard for the acceptance performance. And you see at the bottom, these are possible formats of the learning outcome. Format number one has first an action verb, an object, a target, and a modifiers. Or format two. There's no wrong or right way to do it, but as long as you're using one of those, it should come out appropriate. The target.
Sorry. So sort of how we have the goals, which are broader statements, and the objectives, which are more specific statements relating to that broader goal. I have that part correct? Right?
Yes.
Okay, so when it comes to learning outcomes, is it possible to have more specific learning outcomes relating to a broader learning outcome, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Give your example again.
Like the typing, the outcome?
Yes.
The outcome for the typing class would have the student be able to type 65 words a minute. I'm going to get a little more specific.
Okay.
By touch, sitting for 1 hour.
Okay.
That would be my outcome.
And that includes your criteria. And for target two, for format two, the target, the action verb, the modifier, and the object. So it's a little turn, it's switched around. Because the action verb is after, in format one, the action verb comes first. And that's what I've seen in a lot of learning outcomes. They'll have the action verb first. The student will define, or the students will clarify. Format two, the target comes first, and then the action verb next, modifiers, and then the object. So there's no wrong or right way as long as you have those components there. So how to write learning objectives. And I believe on your handouts, does everyone have handouts with theirs? It was in the brochure, in the booklet. Yes. We're going to practice how to write learning outcomes and objectives. We're going to look at some of the examples that they give us. So the learning objectives specify both the observable behavior and the objects of the behavior. An example that they give you. Students will be able to write a research paper. That's good. So let's add in the criteria. Students will be able to write a research paper in the appropriate scientific style. And then you may want to go even broader, because what's the scientific style? At the end of the field research, students will be able to write a research paper in the appropriate scientific style. I like to add in whether we're going to use APA style, MLA style, so that it's more specific. And the candidates know, the students know, by the end of the course, their focus is to write an APA paper.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll put in there 6th edition, because they'll come in with the 5th edition and say, but I did the APA style, but that's the wrong edition. So I try to have it as specific as possible. And note that the verb you choose will help you focus on what you assess. Because what am I assessing? So what are some of the character?
A quick question based on what you said regarding like writing my APA style. I think the 6th edition has been out for a while now, but as you recall, 3, 4, and 5 were like back to back.
Yes.
Would it have been acceptable to state students will be able to write a research paper using the current APA style?
Yes, that would have been even better. That would be, thank you for correcting me for that. Yes, that would be, that sounds better. Instead of saying 6th edition, because what if the 6th edition is out? So to say the current style. Yes. So, characteristics of good learning outcomes. There is a list of the characteristics. But before I go to the characteristics, I wanted to go over structures of learning outcomes. And that should be on your first page. On the first page. So, structure of a learning statement. You've got the action, the learning statement, and the criteria. So we looked at the formats. Now let's look at a poor example. And someone go ahead and read that for me and tell me why you think it's poor before you read why I say it's poor. Thank you.
Students should know the historically important systems of psychology. I think it's poor, of course, because it's not specific.
Yes.
That's so broad, I can go anywhere on that.
So what about the one that's a little better?
It's still broad to me.
But it's better. It hones in.
Right, it hones in. It's still just broad.
I don't like the verb.
No, I don't like the verb either. Now we'll turn over to the next page. So the good characteristics of learning outcomes. And I'm sorry, that's very small print. It should be specific. So it specify the level, the criterion, or the standard for the knowledge, the skill, the ability, or the disposition that the students must demonstrate. It should include the condition. So it's specific, it includes the condition under which you want your students to demonstrate their knowledge, the skills, ability, and disposition. So going back to that SWOT analysis, what do I want them to demonstrate for me? So I have to include that. Contain active verbs. And what are active verbs? What are those? What do they do? They show movement. It should be measurable. If there's nothing to measure, how do I assess it at the end? It should state it should be stated so that the outcome can be measured. Again, because if it's not stated in a way that it can be measured, how do I know that my students have actually mastered this course? What's the difference from an A student and an F student? And it should be written such that you cannot join elements in one outcome statement that cannot be assessed by a single method. So whatever I'm doing, I have to be able to assess. How do I assess? How do I assess a project?
There's many ways to assess a project.
Tell me.
I could assess it for efficiency. I could assess it for risk. I could assess it to see the long time, cost. There's a lot of ways that I could assess a project.
And why would that be important?
To determine if my project was successful.
Yes. And when they go out to society, they need to know how to assess and evaluate the SWOT analysis. So, here are some guidelines for writing student learning outcome statements. They should be aligned with the mission. They should be clear indicators of the level and the type of competency, such as the areas and fields that focus on the assessment, the knowledge abilities, the values, the attitudes that the students in the program is expected to have within that area and field. It should be specific, distinctive, and specific. It does no good for me to be in the College of Ed and I have the same outcome as business college. And here's an example of a generic outcome. Anyone wants to read that?
Students completing the engineering program will be practiced in design skills.
Why is that generic?
Because I'm not 100% sure what practice and design skills
Yes.
mean.
What is that?
I don't have any idea what that is.
You can learn design skills in many different content areas.
Yes. You want to add something?
No, exactly the same.
So what's the distinctive outcome? It has that action verb in it. It will demonstrate the knowledge of math, science, and engineering fundamentals.
So now I guess my action direction.
Yes.
And the expectations of parents as well.
Yes. And the students are not running around saying, what is this? It's clear for them. It should be framed in terms of the program and not the individual courses or students. And this is if you're doing a full program as well. And it should be simple. And here's an example of a bundled statement. Engineering graduates will demonstrate knowledge of math, science, and engineering fundamentals and gain, competency and basic skills as writing reports, communicating research, ideas, and oral presentations. Those should have been individuals.
Sound like a run-on.
Yes, it is. It's just a run-on. Students are like, wow. We can break those down.
And when you break it down, it will probably be easier for them to follow and comprehend.
Yes, and you'll be able to cover it. Say 1 week we'll do this, the next week we'll cover this area. Any questions so far? And it can be measured by more than one assessment method. So that's something to remember. So how do we fix, let's do the examples. Examples of an outcome statement that can only be measured by one specific assessment method. students completing the engineering program will score over 95% on a locally developed examination. Well, they've got a criteria in there. It's measurable. But what's wrong with it?
From one perspective, they're only measuring from that 195%.
Yes. Say the state assessment. They're taking the state assessment. And in order to pass this course, you need to get 95% on the state assessment. But you did no work in my class. There's nothing done in my class, so I base everything on that single assessment. So in the outcome statement, only one measure can be used to evaluate the student's performance, since this is what is specified in the statement. So we have to be very careful. Students completing the engineering program will demonstrate competency and the ability to apply engineering principles. Is that better?
Yeah, and there.
There's an and there. So what has not been? Specific assessment methods have not been identified in the outcome statement, and thus several measures can be used to evaluate the knowledge that the students have gained as a result of the program. So for that one, it's good. Maybe we should take that and out, or you can leave that one in, but that one is better than the one before. The other one, they passed the state exam, they passed your course.
So with the second one, or really with either one, it would be best that I spell it out, all the different ways you're going to be assessed, and when you give an example, say you would get so much for the discussion board, so much for papers, so much for this, so
Yes.
much for that.
And that's in your syllabus. If you
Right.
look at the syllabus formatting, you want to make sure, because our syllabus and our candidates, and I call them candidates, our students, if it's not in the syllabi, then they'll say, I didn't know about it. So you want to make sure that's included in your syllabus. If you're giving, if you have discussions in your classroom and you want active participation, what I do in my syllabi is I have the candidates when they come in, first day we go over the syllabi, and they know this is what's covered. I also have them to sign a contract that they've read and they understand. They sign it, they pass it to their neighbor signs it as a witness, they hand it in to me, I Xerox it, and I give them a copy back. And I also inform them that any changes to the syllabi or to the course will result in a revised syllabus, which will be posted in Moodle. And I'll post it and I put the date that it's revised in Moodle. So they'll know if I change a date for an exam, I make sure I revise the syllabi. Because the first thing they'll say, well, I didn't know the date was changed. So I make sure that's included in there. And if you look at the syllabi, course prerequisites, the course description, the objectives and the outcomes go in that section. General education outcomes for the course. If I require my students to go on to a lot of the Pearson books require, will they have the component for my education lab? So if that's something that I'm scoring them on, I tell them in the syllabi, this course requires you to have the membership with my education lab through Pearson. I give them the access code and I include the sheet from Pearson on how to log in. All that's included in the syllabi. The objective numbers, the assessment measures, the course requirements, the statement abilities office, emergency evacuation, the grading area. That is very important. I even tell them about the attendance. Attendance is required. I'm in the special education department. I take that very serious. Attendance is required because we cover so much in our courses. So if you miss 2 classes in a semester, you will receive a letter grade drop. It also states if you have chronic tardiness. So many of those will result in a letter grade drop. Because I take it serious. I have a son that was identified with an exception athlete. And I want every teacher that goes into that field to take that position serious. So I make sure it's spelled out in the syllabi. What's the required text? If it's a new edition, I make sure I put that edition in there. And the calendar. What's our plan? The assignments that are due. How are they due? If they're due in APA 6th edition format or the most current format, I require them to do presentations. So when they do a presentation, no longer are they allowed to do PowerPoint. So I put that in the syllabi. It's either slide rocket or Prezi. PowerPoints are not allowed in this course. So anything, and then I put my bibliographies and my references. Anything that I want my students to do is always in the syllabi. So how do we fix an unclear outcome? What I'll do, we'll read through these and then I'll let you all write an outcome. So, fine arts. They give us an example of a broad, then a more specific, and then even more. So the broad. Did everyone read through that? Is there a difference from the broad and more specific and even more specific? What about the general education? Oh, and we've got business here too. General education. Students will be able to think in an interdisciplinary manner. More specific. Asked to solve a problem in the student's field, the student will be able to draw from theories, principles, and or knowledge from other disciplines to help solve the problem. And business. Students will understand how to use technology effectively. Too broad. More specific. Each student will be able to use the word processor, because now I'm specific. Spreadsheets, databases, so I'm thinking about Excel. And presentation graphics, which would be, presentation graphics are Prezi, and preparing their final research project and report. So I'll let you all start writing one for your discipline. Write me something broad and then become specific. And then I'll let you share out. Something broad and then specific. And there's also, don't forget to use your action verbs. You've got your sheet with your action verbs. I want you to identify your action verb as well, so underline your action verb. You ready? Oh, okay. Assess. And if you need, you can go back and look. What was the broad? What's the more specific? Remember, there's no wrong or right. It's just broad or it's specific. Is everyone ready? You want to share?
Well, I wrote, students will understand how Congress functions.
Okay, so that's your broad. Okay, so give us the specific.
Students will draft and defend a bill for the U.S. Senate based upon their knowledge of a particular policy area.
Is that specific enough? Does that sound good to everyone? I like that class. I want to attend that too. What do you have?
Okay, so my broad one is students will be able to assess water solubility of medicines.
Okay.
The more specific one is students will be able to